Part 1. Fog over the City of Water. The fog that day didn't just obscure the view, it distorted the space. The sound of the oars of a few distant gondolas echoed distortedly, as if through a thick layer of cotton. The occasional whistle sounded from the Santa Lucia station, but instead of spreading clearly as usual, the sound was suddenly muffled, then disappeared in the whiteness. Many passengers on Pier 1 had to look long and hard to distinguish between the Vaporetto and the mere reflection of a light bulb on the water. A dispatcher stood near the edge of the pier, a scarf wrapped around his neck, squinting to check the traffic situation on the canal. But all he could see was a white curtain, so thick that even the wooden posts marking the path were lost. He muttered, "This is a dangerous day," but then continued his work as usual, because Venice never stopped because of fog. At one corner of the wharf, a group of school children waited for the train to school, laughing and blowing out small puffs of smoke. A young girl looked out at the water and said to her friend, "I can't see anything. It's like the canal has disappeared." No one knew it was the last moment of peace. On the canal, somewhere in the ivory mist, the engine of the Vaporetto 5042 was approaching. The captain turned on the headlights, but the light penetrated only a few meters, then went out in the mist like a small candle lit in the thick night. He had traveled this route 1,000 times, but that morning, all the familiar landmarks were erased. There was no silhouette of the Scalzi Bridge, no distinctive echo of the stone arch, just a breathless, white silence. And then, with the city wrapped in a harmless cotton blanket, the Vaporetto continued on toward the bridge, a bridge the pilot couldn't see, the passengers couldn't hear, and the fog was hiding what would happen in a few minutes, a collision that would make Venice tremble in the hazy morning. Part 2. The 5042, leaving the terminal. The 5042 left the port like a shadow, silent and cautious, but also with the confidence of a sailor who knew every bend of the Grand Canal by heart. In the small cockpit, the captain had his hand on the control stick, feeling the vibrations of the engine through the old wood. He knew, in this kind of fog, sensation was as important as visibility. The slightest movement of the water could signal a wide turn, a bridge, or an approaching ship. He blew his horn, a low, lingering sound through the fog, but it was quickly swallowed up after a few seconds. There was no response, no signal from any vehicle ahead. That worried him more than the distant sound of an engine. Venice in the fog was so silent that there was always something to hide. On board, the passengers remained calm, or at least tried to appear so. A man in a trench coat checked his watch, anxious for fear of being late for work. A German couple asked each other in whispers, "Which direction are we going?" The stewardess pointed ahead and tried to smile, towards the Rialto, like every day. But even she, who ran this route every morning, could not see the water more than a few meters from the bow. The buildings on either side of the Grand Canal, old palaces from the Venetian Republic, had vanished completely. Instead, patches of mist drifted across the water, sometimes swirling in thin circles like silvery ghosts. The captain used the reflection of the hull hitting the water to gauge the distance to shore. He tilted his ear, listening to see if the sound of the water lapping against the side of the ship had changed. But that morning, the water was also unusually quiet. There was no sound of gondola oars, no sound of other ships passing by. Only the sound of 5042's engine echoed alone, sounding lost in the white space. The captain adjusted the direction slightly, relying on his memory that this part of the channel curved slightly to the left before approaching the Scalzi Bridge. But in the thick fog, all senses can betray people. The familiar curve seemed longer today. The water seemed wider than usual, and a light breeze blew by, carrying a vapor so cold that even those sitting in the cabin shivered. No one on board knew that just a few dozen meters ahead, the Scalzi Bridge pier was towering like a giant stone wall, invisible, but still waiting for the fateful moment. and the 5042, relying on years of habit, was still continuing straight into the white blur that was to become the collision point of that fateful morning. Part 3. Small error in the big mist. Under normal optical conditions, a half-meter deviation is nothing. The Grand Canal is wide, the Vaporetto is small, and the captain is well acquainted with the route. But on that morning, half a meter was the difference between the correct waterline and the collision trajectory. The fog distorted the sounds. The distant engine noise that should have bounced off the stone walls of the canal to tell the captain where he was now scattered like an echo in an empty room. The subtle cues the veteran sailor relied on: the vibration of the water, the sound of waves lapping against the side, the delay and the whistle all disappeared or became unreliable. In the cockpit, the captain looked through the glass, but it only reflected the lights of his own ship, as if 5042 were moving inside a ball of fog with no exit. He slowed down a bit, checked the angle of the rudder, then turned slightly to the right, just to find the main axis of the canal. Just a small movement, just a few degrees of unconscious tilt of the hand. Below, the bow gently parted the water, giving no indication of what was about to happen. Passengers continued to chat in hushed voices or held their breaths, staring out into the white space ahead, hoping the fog would clear in the next stretch, as always. But there was no sign, no trace of the Scalzi Bridge, just a plain white darkness, solid and thick like a giant curtain blocking the way. And in the very moment the ship veered off the waterline, the sound of the water changed. From the soft lapping of the open channel to the heavy bass of the ship approaching the great rock. The captain tilted his head, sensing something was wrong, but it was too late. Ahead, just a few dozen meters from the bow, the Scalzi Bridge pier appeared like a ghost in the mist, not slowly, but as if springing out of the white space, too fast to react. 5042 was still moving forward. The mist was too thick, the distance was too short, and that small half-meter deviation, combined with the mist like a giant trap, had sent the ship into its fateful orbit. Part 4. Impact. The impact wasn't just a sound, it was a tearing through space, as if the Grand Canal had been ripped open. The bow of the 5042, designed to glide smoothly through the water, didn't stand a chance against the massive white stone of the Scalzi Bridge. The entire force of the impact was concentrated on the forward deck, causing the wooden floor to lift up, the railing to bend, the steel plates to fold together like fingers snapped in an instant. A passenger standing near the glass door was thrown forward, hitting the handrail and sliding to the floor. An old man sitting in the front row barely had time to raise his hand, but the force of the impact was so great that he was pinned against the curved metal wall, which had been a safe space just seconds before. In that moment, everything happened too quickly for anyone to comprehend. What they felt most clearly wasn't the sound, but the feeling. A sharp, cold jolt, like a compression of the spine. The train lurched sideways, sending the passengers in the middle of the cabin teetering like tumblers. People tried to grab seats, doors, anything, but the impact was so sudden that most were thrown from their positions. A child started crying, but the sound was so thick with fog that it was inaudible to those just a few meters away. Outside, water splashed up in a large white streak, but the fog swallowed it up immediately, obliterating the scene as soon as it appeared. The metallic crunch continued in waves creak, creak, kirk, as the train's hull scraped against the bridge piers. Small sparks flew and died instantly in the damp mist. The cabin lights flickered on and off, casting a pale yellow-green glow on the passengers' faces. Then the Vaporetto came to a complete stop. A heavy silence fell, the silence of Venice in the fog. But this time it was no longer peaceful, but tense, oppressive, like the surface of water about to storm. And in that silence, everyone understood, though no one said it aloud, that this collision was no small accident. It was a catastrophe, and they were caught in the middle of it. Part 5. The Moment of Chouse. One moment they had sat silently, staring into the mist as if at a still picture. The next, their world collapsed into a screech of steel and unguarded impacts. No one could tell what came before or what came after, only the sensation of their bodies being thrown together like pieces of an invisible giant. A young man tried to stand up but hit his head on the low ceiling, dizzy. He heard a woman sobbing, my child, but could not see the child because the mist poured into the compartment through the cracks, creating a hazy white vapor. The smell of engine oil and damp wood was so strong and suffocating that it made everyone sick. In the middle of the compartment, a man tried to squeeze toward the emergency exit, but his foot hit something soft. Another man had fallen to the floor. He bent down to catch him, but the panicked crowd behind him pushed him flat on his face, forcing him to crawl on his elbows to avoid being trampled. Screams for help mixed with the crack of wooden planks like small guns continued to ring out. A little girl of about 8 tried to hold on to her mother's hand, but their hands slipped as the train shuddered again. She fell into a corner, caught between 2 rows of seats. Her feet kicked at the empty space, invisible to anyone because the fog had filled the cabin like smoke. The ceiling lights flickered, turning everything into a blur of light and dark like a glitch in a nightmare movie. At the bow, where the force was strongest, a terrible void had opened up. It was as if someone had crushed the front of the train with an iron fist. Wood was torn to shreds, steel folded like tinfoil. Some of the passengers on that side were almost lost in the chaos, not because they were no longer there, but because their bodies were buried in the crumpled, shapeless material. It all happened in seconds, but for the survivors, it seemed like a lifetime. A lifetime of panic, pain, and helplessness, as they realized the ship had stopped, but the disaster was only just beginning. Part 6. Calls from the Canal. The cries did not carry as far as they usually did. They did not reverberate off the ancient stone walls, nor ripple along the water as they usually did. Instead, they were muffled as they left the hold, as if the fog had become a thick wall, swallowing every syllable. The captain staggered across the deck, his knees still shaking from the impact. He tried to turn on the signal light several times, but the red light only penetrated a few meters before disappearing into the dense whiteness. He shouted hoarsely, "Someone! Help! We've hit the bridge!" But even he was not sure which direction his voice was coming from. In the hold, the trapped passengers heard his voice, but it was faint, like an echo from the bottom of a well. They tried to knock on the hull, making faint, desperate rattling sounds. The cries touched the mist, dispersed, and then sank into the canal, which was darker with leaking engine oil. On the shore, an old man who lived near the Scalzi Bridge stopped when he heard a long metallic screech, a sign of a major collision. He walked to the edge of the canal, but there was only a white wall in front of him. There was no ship in sight, no people, no movement. Only a faint sound that sent a chill down his spine, a moan, a muffled cry, and the steady drip of water from somewhere under the bridge. 2 young men ran forward, calling out, "Is anyone there?" But the question vanished into the mist as if it had never existed. They bent down, trying to see through the gap in the mist below the arch, but all they saw was a thick darkness, where the 5042 was stuck, as if swallowed by the rock. From the ship, the captain continued to call hoarsely, "Someone's hurt! We need help!" His voice echoed and then disappeared, leaving the water eerily silent. Venice, a city famous for its echoes through its canals, seemed like a giant bottomless well where sound fell without bouncing back. And in that silence, the people trapped on 5042 could only hope that the fog would clear fast enough so that someone would see them before it was too late. Part 7. Rescue in the Mist. The first minutes were a race against the blindness of the city. The rescue team spread out along the canal banks, shining their flashlights and listening desperately. They had to bend down to catch the slightest sounds: the clanking of metal, the gasps of breath, the dripping of water, finally coalescing in a single direction under the Scalzi Bridge. As they closed in, the first thing they saw was not the ship, but a denser fog, as if 5042 were sinking in a giant steam chamber. They anchored the lifeboats to the piers and began climbing the slippery, foggy bridge. From above, the searchlights shone through the white curtain, creating faint streaks of light, like swords pointing into the endless void. There was no ship in sight, only streaks of light bent by the steam. As the rope was lowered, one of the rescuers suddenly heard a tapping sound, very small, very weak, like someone tapping a fingernail on metal. He pressed his ear to the cold air, trying to find his bearings, and shouted, "Here, down here." The team immediately rushed to the spot he had pointed, and through the fog, a section of the ship's hull began to appear, crushed against the piers like crumpled paper. They had to use crowbars to try to pry open each folded steel plate. Every time they pried out a few centimeters, they heard the painful groans of the people trapped inside. The strong smell of engine oil mixed with the smell of damp wood, the stench of canal water, and the smell of hot metal, a combination that made many rescuers dizzy, forcing them to cover their mouths with wet towels to continue working. One rescuer later recalled, "We couldn't see anyone clearly. We only saw hands bloody, trembling, sticking out from the steel cracks. No faces, no clear voices, just hands." In one of the largest gaps, they saw two passengers pinned, unable to turn. A man was pinned between the crumpled seat frame and the steel wall, his face pale, his breathing so weak he could barely hear it. A woman behind him was held by the broken seat itself, only able to move a couple of fingers to signal that she was alive. At the bow, where the impact was strongest, the rescue team could find almost no intact gaps. Wood was broken, metal was bent, and wires were sticking out like the guts of a giant carp torn in two. They had to cut through each piece of steel, but fearing that each cut would injure the people inside, every movement was slow, shaky, and calculated. The mist still did not clear. The water was as still as glass. And in that dense space, the calls for help, the groans, the cracking of steel, blended into a sound that no one on the team would ever forget: the sound of life trying to cling to a city shrouded in fog and stone. Part 8. The Last Minutes. Some passengers lost consciousness immediately after the impact. Others were seriously injured, lying still on the cold, damp floor, their breaths mixed with steam, sounding like wind escaping from the cracks in the steel. For them, time seemed to stand still. Each second passed so slowly, it seemed frozen in the white mist. Even as the rescue team began to break through the metal to get people out, the sounds of hammers, steel cracking, people calling out to each other, were swallowed by the mist, distorted and unfamiliar, as if coming from another world. Someone called out the name of a loved one in despair, their voice lost and broken. A trembling man tried to shake the woman beside him, but his arms slipped on the icy water. Someone cried because he couldn't find a companion. Someone bowed his head, clutching the helpless hand of a person sitting next to him, not knowing if he was still alive. All the sounds merged into a muffled noise, no longer a scream or a cry, but a group of people struggling to hold on to life. When the last steel door was bent and the last person was pulled out of the forward hold, the rescue team paused for a few seconds, not to rest, but to look into the dark void where the ship's bow had been. The entire Vaporetto bow had caved in as if squeezed by a giant hand. The steel bars had curled into waves. The hull had crumbled like eggshells. The captain stood staring at the metal, his eyes watering in the mist. He whispered almost inaudibly, "No, this is not my ship anymore." Venice was completely silent, except for the sound of water dripping from the broken bow, falling steadily onto the canal like a clock ticking down on something lost forever. Part 9. The truth behind the fog. What the investigation revealed sent a chill down the spines of Venetians even more than that foggy morning. Records showed that this was not an unforeseeable accident, but one that had been reported many times, but no one had stopped to fix it. Reports from the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds recorded at least 5 near misses in this same stretch of canal, especially on foggy days. Some captains filed complaints with ACTV, Venice's traffic authority, saying that when the fog fell, the area near the Scalzi Bridge disappeared completely, and the bow of the ship was just a few meters from the bridge piers without even knowing it. But the warnings were dismissed as a familiar Venice occupational hazard. The signs near the bridge were old, the paint peeling. The letters faded so much so that they were barely visible in normal weather, let alone in fog so thick that the lights themselves were distorted. The canal-side navigation lights had been in use for years, were not powerful enough to penetrate the fog, and many of the bulbs had failed but not been replaced. No one thought that a single dimmed bulb could lead a boat into the white stone blade of the Scalzi Bridge. The investigation also revealed another painful problem. The Vaporetto's path was too close to the bridge's piers, a legacy of a design that was left over from the days of small, slow, and light boats. But when the heavy metal motorized Vaporettos were introduced, the path became a dangerous landing that no one bothered to adjust. Engineers warned that even a small deviation in low visibility conditions could lead to a catastrophic collision. And it was true. A half-meter deviation, just half a meter, is so small that it would be imperceptible to the average person, but it was the perfect distance to send 5,042 straight into the bridge's piers. The final pages of the report contained a sentence that shocked Venice. The disaster did not happen because of the fog. It happened because we let the fog replace vigilance. In other words, it was no accident. It was something that had been waiting to happen for a long time, and on the morning of the 5th of January 1982, it only needed a small yaw to make it happen. Part 10. The Legacy of a Foggy Morning. In the days after the crash, the Grand Canal no longer had its familiar gentle beauty. Water police patrolled constantly, technicians hung under bridges to measure distances, and boat captains passing through the Scalzi area slowed to almost zero. The fog still appeared as it did every year, but in the minds of residents, it was no longer a romantic curtain covering the city, but a reminder of the fragility of all movement on the water. Some survivors returned to the scene of the accident, standing still, watching the canal. They said that every time they heard the light sound of metal hitting wood, the familiar sound of Venetian boats, their hearts beat faster. One woman who had been trapped between 2 rows of seats said that for months afterward, she would wake up in the middle of the night to hear creak in her head, the unforgettable sound of metal being torn apart. The city has changed. Brighter beacons, new radar on larger ships, and navigation teams retrained to handle extreme fog. But for many, the changes have come too late. They say Venice has always been beautiful, but also fierce in its own way, and that morning in 1982, beauty and danger collided in a moment too quick for anyone to prepare for. Every year, on the morning of January 5, Venetians still place bouquets of white flowers on the railings of the Scalzi Bridge. The flowers fall into the water, drifting slowly across the canal like little souls. Candles are lit along the banks, their light shimmering through the thin layer of winter mist, reflecting off the bridge's arches, a reminder of what was lost. And when the mist settles on the water, just as it did that fateful morning, everyone who has witnessed it feels the same. Venice has never been so quiet. Not that the city was silent, but that everyone seemed to be listening, very quietly, to see if the old steel clang echoed back in the mist.